Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in April 2025, and there were quite a few of them. It was a really good reading month, so let's go ahead and dive in. The first book that I read is one called The Night Trade. This is the second book in the Livia Loan series by Barry Eisler. This is basically a book about a woman who, as a child, was part of a trafficking. She was trafficked, and so she becomes someone who is now trying to catch human traffickers as part of her job. She's a police officer, but she also does this kind of vigilante work on the side. And so this is kind of the story of this series and how she's engaging in kind of catching these criminals. This is one that I've enjoyed reading the first couple books. I probably would continue in the series. I'm not sure how long the series is. It might just be a trilogy, but I enjoyed that one. Then as a very quick read, I read this kind of short, it's not a novella, it's nonfiction, but it's called How to Consciously Design Your Ideal Future by Benjamin Hardy. One of the things I like about Benjamin Hardy, I've read several of his books now, is he's very straightforward and he has some really kind of interesting ideas. He does work in like organizational psychology, and so I enjoyed that one. Then I picked up a book called Yoga Life, Habits, Poses, and Breathwork to Channel Joy Amidst the Chaos by Brett Larkin. And Brett Larkin is actually the person that I did online yoga training with during the pandemic. And so I'm familiar with her work. And one of the things that I really appreciate about her is that she's very focused on how you can create an individualized practice that's very unique to what you need. And this book basically kind of walks you through how to do that in ways that I thought were really helpful and practical. So I enjoyed going back and reading that. Then I read Poser, My Life in 23 Yoga Poses by Claire Dederer. And this is a book about a woman who's living in Seattle and she's kind of at midlife and she's using yoga as a way to kind of like find her way at this midlife chapter when she has a family, she has a job. And I actually liked this book so much that I went out and found another book by her that I ended up reading as well, which it was a very different book. I'll talk about it in a little bit. But I really like the style of her writing. And so that was fun to pick up. I then read a book called The Neurodiversity Edge, The Essential Guide to Embracing Autism, ADHD, Dyslexia, and Other Neurological Differences for Any Organization by Maureen Dunn. And this is a book that kind of reminded me a little bit about, I'm not gonna remember the name. It has Canary in the title, but it was basically about neurodiversity at work. I'll put the title in the video so you can see it. But The Canary Code, that's what it's called. And both of these books are basically about how you can create organizational changes to be more friendly to neurodiverse communities. And so I enjoyed that one as well. Then I read a couple pretty short books on yoga. One is called Mental Health Aware Yoga by Lauren Tober. This is an author who's really focusing on how you can utilize yoga for people who have various mental health challenges. And also if you are a yoga teacher, what you can do if someone is having like a mental health challenge while they're in your class. So for example, if someone has like a panic attack in the middle of a yoga class, I actually found this to be really interesting. And I'd given it some, level of thought, but I appreciated being able to kind of walk through the author's kind of deep thoughts on this. Then I started to read a small series. I actually read these out of order a little bit because of just when they came in at my local library. But they're a book on the chakra system. And the first one is on sacral chakra. It is by Cindy Dale. And I will say this series, I read a couple so far. It's pretty woo. So if you are someone who's interested in learning about chakra systems, it's basically an set of energy systems within the body that's tied to yoga practice. And there are different parts of the body that are kind of affiliated with these different things. The book that I would probably recommend, which is quite lengthy, is Eastern Body, Western Mind, because it really does a deep dive into the psychology of chakra and how it's kind of tied together. But this book is kind of an overview, and it talks about like if you are trying to like nurture this part of the chakra system, what would you eat? And like there's colors that are affiliated, and there's other kinds of components that describe it. Again, it gets pretty woo, but if you're interested, it's kind of an interesting view of how to kind of think about that. The next book I picked up is the fifth book in the Tattered and Torn series called Fractured Sky by Catherine Cowles. This was my favorite book in the series. I thought it was so good. I loved how this series wrapped up, and she basically kind of saved the best for last in terms of the story of this character who shows up in book one and is kind of like a recurring character throughout the series, and she finally gets her own story. I really, really enjoyed that one. Then I picked up The Tennis Partner by Abraham Verghese. Abraham Verghese is a very well-known novelist. One of the novels he's known for is called Cutting for Stone. I read another novel of his not too long ago. And The Tennis Partner is a true story about his relationship with this man when he is a practicing doctor and this other man is a resident in the program to become a doctor, and he is also an addict. And they develop a friendship because they play tennis together. And it's really kind of tragic. I mean, like how he tells this story, but he tells it almost like a novel. I mean, it's very well done. And I find this author to be so incredibly talented. So I really enjoyed that one. Then I picked up a book called Simply Psychology by DK Publishing. I'm not even sure who the author is. It's just listed as DK Publishing. But this is a book that's basically an illustrated guide to like introductory psychology. It's not written for children. It's written for, I would say, teenagers, young adults, but definitely adults. I really thought it was kind of a fun way of approaching like entry-level psychology terms. And this is just an area that I can't even remember how I stumbled across this, but I ordered it from my local library, and I'm glad that I did. Then I picked up a book called Breathe by Jean Hall, Simply Breathing Techniques for a Calmer, Happier Life. As you can tell, really digging into the yoga practice and different books around that this month. And breathwork is a huge part of yoga practice. And so this was a fun one. It talks about different kinds of strategies for breathing techniques that you can build in. And I enjoyed that one too. Then I read a book called Juniper Bean Resorts to Murder. This is the first book in the Happily Ever Homicide series by Gracie Ruth Mitchell. And I have to admit, I wasn't expecting to like this as much as I did. I found it incredibly charming. If you like kind of a Gilmore Girls vibe, like small town, quirky, it's got that. And I really, really enjoyed it. So I have the second book kind of on my radar. I'd like to pick it up at some point, but I really like the author and what they did there. Next up, I picked up a book that everybody was talking about called The Wedding People by Alison Espach. This is a book that a lot of people really, really loved. And it's basically the story about this woman who goes to this resort planning to kill herself. And she gets kind of pulled into this very large wedding. They think that she's there as a wedding guest, and she's not. And then she develops this kind of relationship with the bride, like a friendship. And they kind of hit it off, basically. And it's a weird, quirky little book. I will say, I don't think I liked it as much as other people have who've just been like head over heels for this book, but it was solid and I did enjoy it. It's not one that I think I would want to revisit or that is one that would be like on my top 10 list for the year though. All right, then I picked up Heartsick. This is the first book in the Archie Sheridan and Gretchen Lowell series by Chelsea Cain. I read this series, I don't know, at least 10 years ago and decided I wanted to revisit it in 2025. It is basically the story of a woman who is a serial killer and the cop who becomes kind of obsessed with her. He's the guy who catches her and puts her away in prison. But they have this kind of very strange relationship. And I had forgotten a lot about this series. There's also this kind of reporter character who comes in to the series as well. And they're trying to catch another serial killer, in this first book. I will love reading the rest of this series. It reminded me of how much I enjoyed it. I really like Chelsea Cain's work. She's done a lot of interesting things. And there was another series that she wrote like a first book in that I also really loved. And she never continued writing in it. So I'll follow her, in what she's done. But this is a series from a while back, definitely worth picking up. Okay, the next book I picked up is one called The First Girl Child. It is the first book in the Chronicles of Saylock by Amy Harmon. This is basically a book about a young boy who is he goes to live with like his uncle, and when he is born, his mother puts out like a curse that there will be no more female children in this land because of her experience of being kind of cast out by the man that she loved. And so that's what happens. There are no female children, and it's kind of causing all of this concern because, they will die out if there are no female children. And so this boy ends up growing up, and there's a girl child who eventually comes into the narrative, and he's kind of caring for her and protecting her. I thought this book was really creative. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but it was solid. There's a second book in the series. I'm not sure if I'll continue it or not, but I did enjoy this first installment. All right, next up, I picked up a book called Bad Mother by Mia Sheridan. This is a book about a female cop who is chasing after a serial killer. I admit that I started this book on audio and I felt like I wasn't paying enough attention. And so I actually went back and started it again from the beginning to like reread and make sure I was understanding what was going on and really following this narrative. It is kind of twisty. There's a killer that we have the perspective of the killer, but we can't really tell who the killer is. Like we're getting like notes and kind of stories about the killer's childhood. And this female cop is somehow tied to the killer, but we're not sure how. I really like this. Mia Sheridan really stretches her writing genre muscles. Like I've read romances by her. I've read, this is obviously like a mystery thriller. She's done some other stuff in the past too that's a little bit like sci-fi. It's kind of fun, and I think she has a really good time doing it, so I enjoy that. All right, then I picked up another book that people have been just talking about all over the place, which is Broken Country by Claire Leslie Hall. And this is a book about a woman who, I'm trying to remember how to describe this without giving away spoilers. There's a woman who, in her younger years, is in love with someone. They have a relationship. And then they break up, and she is now in adulthood. She's married. She has a family, and he comes back to the town, and it kind of like triggers all these things. I will say there was some stuff that happened at the very end of this book. It's a bit of like a mystery thriller. You're kind of trying to, not thriller, mystery, solid mystery, but you're trying to figure out what's going on, with this kind of set of characters. I did figure it out in the end, so I didn't feel like it was like super surprising. Beautifully written. I mean, I really enjoyed it from that perspective. But this is another one where I feel like people are just head over heels with it. And I thought it was solid, but again, maybe not one of my like top 10 books for the year. All right. Then I read my NetGalley challenge book for the month. This was an arc called Encore, A High Achiever's Guide to Thriving in Retirement by Elizabeth Zelinka Parsons. I have been reading advanced readers copies, which aren't always advanced readers copies by the time I get to them because the book may already be published. But I was really drawn to the title of A High Achiever's Guide to Retirement because I do coach people who are headed into retirement. And I was kind of curious because a lot of folks in higher ed who I coach are high achievers. The thing that was slightly disappointing to me about this book, although I did find it interesting, is high achiever was basically code for incredibly wealthy, which I don't think a lot of high achievers are necessarily always incredibly wealthy. And so that was a little bit like, okay, like I guess that's what you're, using to signal that. Whereas I know a lot of high achievers who have like a really high standard for themselves, but they're not necessarily incredibly wealthy. And so I wouldn't conflate those things. In this book, it felt like they were a little conflated. That said, I thought it had some interesting ideas about basically how do you ease yourself into a new concept of what your life will look like when you're going toward retirement if you have always had a lot of like identity within your work. And so that part I found really interesting. All right, then I picked up a book called Tilt by Emma Petit, not sure how that's pronounced. Of course, I was drawn to this book because it's about an earthquake in the Pacific Northwest. And this woman who's in IKEA when it happens, and then she has to like travel around to like find, her husband and what's going on. I will say I loved the premise of this book more than I liked the execution. I'm so sorry to say that because I wanted to like this book so much just based on what it was about. I thought it was fine. It just didn't really hold my attention all that much because this woman is just basically wandering around after an earthquake. If you read this book and like it, I'm glad. Like I wanted to like it more than I did, but unfortunately that one wasn't quite for me. All right, then I picked up a book called Financial Joy: Banish Debt, Grow Your Money, and Unlock Financial Freedom in 10 Weeks by Ken Okorafor. This is a book that I think is for people in their 20s who don't know much about finance. I will say as someone who's in my early 40s, I knew a lot of the things that this book was talking about. It was nice reminders of things, but I was definitely like, as he's talking about like building this financial freedom plan, like there were a lot of things that I was like, yep, done that. Yep, done that. Yep, done that. So I didn't really take away a lot that was new. That said, I think this would be a great book for somebody who's like graduating from college or graduating from grad school and they're kind of trying to get themselves, figured out, or going into a first job, that kind of thing. So I'm glad I read it. It actually gave me a nice affirmation of what I already know. Okay, then next I read a book called Love and Trouble, A Midlife Reckoning by Claire Dederer. This is the same woman who wrote Poser. So I read Poser, really enjoyed it, and wanted to pick up this other book. This is a book that is basically about how the author is coming to terms with kind of her like midlife sexuality. It is a lot about her teenage years and sexuality and kind of her midlife years and sexuality. It was interesting. It was just very different than the Poser book. The style was still kind of the crisp style that I really enjoyed. And I could definitely see reading these books and kind of studying how she's doing kind of her essay style chapters because I really enjoyed them. So I'm glad I picked it up, but I did like Poser better of the two. Then I read a book called The Life We Bury by Allen Eskins. I randomly came across this in my library, and it's basically the story of a teenager or maybe a college student who goes to visit a man in a kind of like assisted living facility, and he's supposed to be interviewing him. And this guy turns out to be someone who's living there, but he came directly from a prison. And he was in this prison because he was there for rape and murder. And so the guy who's interviewing him is like trying to learn his story a little bit. And of course we find out everything is not as it seems, and it starts to kind of like unravel. So I enjoyed that one too. Then I read a book called You Killed Me First. This is one of the latest books by John Marrs, who's a favorite author of mine. He writes thrillers, mysteries, and some speculative fiction, and all of them are found to be really creative. This one is a book that, like, the opening chapter is basically about a woman who is being trapped inside a bonfire in like this suburban neighborhood, and someone is trying to kill her. And it's very twisty. It reminded me a little bit of, I'm not gonna be able to remember, Dangerous Housewives. If any of you watched that show and there was kind of some like twisty suburban storylines, this one was kind of like that. I don't know if this was his inspiration, but it gave that vibe. So if you liked that show, I would definitely pick up this book. All right, then I picked up a book called A Town Called Solace by Mary Lawson. And this is a book that was longlisted for the Booker Prize. It is definitely a literary fiction book. And it's basically told from a few different perspectives. There's a girl who's gone missing and her younger sister is one of the perspectives. There's this older woman that is living in a neighbor house next door. And so we hear her perspective. And there's this guy who moves into her house. He like inherits her house, and we hear that perspective as well. I actually really enjoyed the storytelling of this particular book and how it wove in and out of the different perspectives of these three characters. That was a good one. I enjoyed that one this month. All right, then I read a book called Homegrown by Jeffrey Toobin. It is called Timothy McVeigh and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremism. After I read this book, I immediately went and watched a documentary on the Oklahoma City bombing, because that's basically what this book is about. It connects the Oklahoma City bombing and kind of the history of what led Timothy McVeigh to do this act to our current day kind of right-wing extremism that we saw on like January 6th. And it was fascinating. I mean, I really, really enjoyed this. I actually went and looked up this author's other books just to see if there was any other topics I was interested in, because I really liked his writing style. I did listen to this on audio, but it really got me kind of sucked into thinking about the history of the Oklahoma City bombing, which happened to be like the anniversary of this event happened while I was reading it. Basically, it was like the 30th anniversary of this event. So really, really fascinating. If that sounds at all interesting to you, I would definitely recommend picking it up. Okay, this month I also read the duology, These Violent Delights. The first book is called These Violent Delights, and then the second book is called Our Violent Ends. This is by Chloe Gong. This is such a creative duology. It is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet. It is set in the 1920s in Shanghai. It involves these like two street gangs, and there's this pandemic that's happening, but it has this kind of like sci-fi feel. It actually reminded me a little bit of Melissa Meyer, who I read months ago. And she has this kind of like cyborg fairy tale, kind of tone. And this Chloe Gong, it reminded me a little bit of that. Beautifully written. The themes of the Shakespearean themes were super interesting. And it was not a direct connection to Romeo and Juliet. I wasn't sure what that would mean when I saw it was a retelling. Certainly the themes are there, but it's very unique and it's very original in its own right. So again, if that sounds interesting, I would definitely recommend picking it up. All right, then as kind of a palate cleanser, I read another Frida McFadden, which I've been kind of picking her up. She's very fast, very quick, storytelling. And I read The Perfect Son. This is a book that is basically about, now I'm having to remind myself, there's so many of her books I've read recently. So this is a book about this woman and she has these concerns that her son is basically a psychopath. And then the police come and say that they're concerned that one of his classmates, who's a girl, is missing. And so she starts thinking that he did it. And she's convinced that he did this thing. And of course it gets super twisty after that. I don't know. I think Frida McFadden is kind of fun. I think that she does books that they're not necessarily formulaic, but they have these kind of twisty, cliffhanger chapters that are pretty fun to engage with. So then I picked up a book called The Fear Cure by Lisa Rankin. And this is a book that I've read other Lisa Rankin books in the past. Lisa Rankin is basically trained as a traditional doctor, but she leaves the traditional medical profession to move into more of a kind of alternative medicine space. The thing that I liked about this book is she basically talks about the connection between our health and fear, and how if you have extreme amounts of fear, there is science that says it will negatively affect your health. And I think that's really interesting. There were sections of this book, though, that felt a little bit like toxic positivity to me, where it was kind of you can kind of change your mindset around anything horrible that's happened to you. And that just felt a little bit hard. I could definitely see some people reading that and thinking you are glossing over what could be extreme trauma for some people and saying it's almost not a big deal, or you can handle it in a way that she's kind of sharing in this book. I think it could be misinterpreted. I'm not sure that's what the author is intending, but as I was reading it, I just thought somebody could really read this in maybe this way that you're not intending. However, the first part of the book that's kind of about the science of fear, I thought was really interesting. Then I picked up Ready Player 2. This is the second book in the Ready Player 1 series by Ernest Cline. If you like Ready Player 1, which has all of these gaming elements to it that are super fun, you would love Ready Player 2. It's basically more of the same. It has the same characters from Ready Player 1. They're going through all these different challenges. There's all this gaming stuff in there. It was super fun. I think both of these books are so creative. And I heard that Ready Player 1 is a film. I think Ready Player 2 has been optioned. I think it would make a great film too. So I enjoyed that. Then I read a book called Making Things Happen, Mastering Project Management by Scott Birkin. Project management is definitely a topic of interest for me. I think that this book focuses more on traditional project management like you would see in a software company versus project management that you would see in kind of my field of higher education. That said, it's a pretty good introduction. It's lengthy. I listened to it on audio. But I do think if you're just looking for a general overview of some tips around project management, this is probably a pretty good book to pick up. Then I read a book called Future Proof: 9 Rules for Surviving in the Age of AI by Kevin Roose. I actually was pleasantly surprised by this book. I was expecting something different than what it was. I think I was expecting a book that was kind of defending AI. And really what this author says is there's some real challenges that we have in front of us when it comes to utilizing AI, and we need to take it seriously, but we don't want to have completely an overblown understanding of what's going to happen. And so he really gives a lot of concrete examples of different companies and how they're utilizing it. Where is it kind of taking over certain industries? Where is it not taking over certain industries? And then he talks about what can you do to basically future-proof your own job, no matter what industry you're in. Really interesting stuff. Relatively short, so I was able to do a quick read on that, and I really enjoyed it. Then I picked up a really quick book called Practices for Embodied Living: Experiencing the Wisdom of Your Body by Hilary McBride. This is a book, it's one of actually the better books I've read on embodiment. It's very reflective. It has a lot of journaling prompts, a lot of reflective questions to try to help you understand how are you feeling certain things in your body. If you struggle with a mind-body connection, this is definitely a book that I would recommend. I really liked what the author did here. Okay, then I picked up basically back to back the first 2 books in the Imperium series by Rebecca Yarros, Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, which were rereads for me. I have read Fourth Wing now. This is the third time. I have read Iron Flame. This is the second time. And I'm preparing to now read Onyx Storm, which is the third book in the series. What I decided to do with these first two, which I've actually never done before, is to read them on graphic audio. Now, if you are not familiar with graphic audio, the way it's described is a movie in your mind. And so it is basically the text of the story is like the dialogue, but everything that's like descriptive that they can turn into sound is turned into sound. So there's all these sound effects. There's usually a full cast that is in the graphic audio. So it's a form of audiobook, but it's often shorter than the traditional audiobook because all of this stuff is turned into sound that's kind of happening in the background. So you can kind of think about this as like old time radio shows that have kind of this sound effect stuff. Really, really fun. I don't know that I would want to do graphic audio for the first read of a book because I like to hear all the original language, even on audio, of what an author has put into a book. But if you were rereading something, I think it's a great way to do it. So I actually already found another graphic audiobook that I want to reread, and I checked it out from my library. And I may actually just search my library to see what they have in graphic audio because I'd never experienced it before, and I really enjoyed that. All right, couple more books that I read in the month. The next book I read is a book called Famous Last Words by Gillian McAllister. I've read this author before, and she has some really fun twists. She writes like kind of these mystery thrillers. And basically, this is the story about a woman who is going back to work from maternity leave. They have, she and her husband have like a 9-month-old daughter. And the day she goes back to work, her husband leaves her this note on the table. And it's kind of mysterious and she doesn't really understand it. And when she goes to work, she then is confronted is too strong of a word. Police come and find her, and basically her husband has taken a bunch of people hostage, and she doesn't know why. And this is like completely out of his nature, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And I don't want to share too much about this, but what I will say is at some point in the book, it skips to like 7 years later, and she's still trying to understand like what happened with this situation. And the only thing about this book, it's going to sound strange for me to say this given the premise of it, but it was mostly believable. I mean, how many times do people take other people hostage? But it was mostly believable, except for the fact in this 7-year jump, I thought it should have been like a 2-year jump, not a 7-year jump. Like the 7-year jump was too much. Like I just thought she would be living in a completely different life 7 years later. 2 years later, it made more sense. So that was like one small thing that I was like, I'm not sure I agree with like the time leap that you took here. But the rest of it was pretty fun. And then the last book that I read is one called From Strength to Strength, Finding Success, Happiness, and Deep Purpose in the Second Half of Life by Arthur Brooks. This book I found a little bit challenging. First of all, I read the first chapter and I was like, this is the most depressing book in the entire world, because basically what it says is, depending on how old you are, and even as someone in my like early 40s, he was basically like, you're going to start a mental decline before you think you are. And he was basically like, your mid 40s or your early 40s is like the late stage of that. So you've already like gone through, you know, like the best part of your like mental energy. And I just thought like, whoa, okay, like where are we going with this book? Now he, in the next chapter, kind of starts to talk about like, but there are these other stages of like what you can contribute in your professional life. But he almost lost me after the first chapter because I was like, this is so depressing, like what you're describing about what is happening. I will say there's also like a sneaky spiritual element that comes in toward the end of this book that I was kind of expecting, given where some of the like anecdotes went that this author was sharing. And so it was just a little bit off for me. I felt like the hook in the beginning was really depressing. I feel like there might have been a different way to kind of like introduce this topic and kind of give some people hope about where it was going before you just kind of like slam them into this wall of like, you are in mental decline and you don't realize you're in mental decline. That said, there was some interesting stuff here. Like, I think if you're interested in kind of this topic and you're willing to get through the first chapter, like keep going. It could be something interesting to pick up. And I generally like books that talk about aging and talk about transition and how you can kind of like work yourself through, you know, that transition to aging. Aging is actually something that I don't have a problem with. Like I like birthdays and things like that. I don't have a problem with aging. And I know a lot of people do. And so they think about this transition in kind of a different way. But this one, yeah, it was an interesting beginning, and there were definitely some surprises along the way too. So those are all of the books that I read in the month of April of 2025. Definitely some good ones in there, and hopefully some ones you might add to your own to be read pile. I hope you'll stick around to see what books I'm hoping to read in May of 2025. And until then, happy reading.